All right, so we're wrapping up our discussion of inflation with this video by looking at some of the impact on the economy when we have inflation, some of the issues, some of the cost or negative aspects of having inflation. So I think there's this general sense that inflation is eroding purchasing power, therefore is bad. And it's not that that's wrong at all, but that's only necessarily true from one person's point of view. We want to look at the macro view. We want to look at the overall economy. And so the inflation myth we're holding out is that inflation erodes the average purchasing power of income in the economy. We're saying that is not true, okay? When you look at the overall average purchasing power of income in the economy, there's been some winners and some losers, but the average purchasing power should stay the same. So inflation would redistribute purchasing power from one group to another, okay? Within any transaction, there's one person on the buy side, there's one person on the sell side, and the buyer's paying these higher prices and the seller's getting paid higher prices. So the buyer is losing and the seller's winning. So it sounds like I've just contradicted myself. But again, we look at the overall economy, we look at the macro view. We're not seeing a decrease in the average real income in the economy because most people are going to be buyers and sellers, right? You're going to buy goods, but you sell your labor. So in a net overall average sense, there's no decrease in the average purchasing power of the economy. All right, so that was talking about overall inflation. Now we want to kind of divide it up into expected or anticipated inflation and unanticipated inflation. And that will also help us understand the impact of inflation on the economy. When you are looking at expected inflation, there is not going to be a shift of purchasing power because the buyers and sellers are going to take steps to protect themselves so that in a real sense, they are paying what they should be paying. They're not going to be paying too much for inflation or receiving too little or however you want to phrase it. So expected inflation, anticipated inflation will have no redistribution. One way to see this is this approximation rule, okay? And here's the equation you want to be familiar with because it does capture how people deal with inflation when they are expecting it. So, for example, anybody who's loaning money, making some sort of investment, they're going to have some idea of a real interest rate return they need to make this particular investment profitable. So right now we'll just look at an example of a bank loaning money. So for a bank to be willing to loan money, there's going to be some real rate that they think they need, or otherwise it's not even worth a good deal to them. And then there's going to be some expectation of inflation. So what they essentially do is they build in the inflation with the real interest rate, and then they come up with the nominal interest rate, which is the one that's actually stated on your loan. So if you've ever gotten a loan for a car or a mortgage, they quote you a rate, let's say it was 6%. That 6% is your nominal rate. And it's including any expectation of inflation and whatever real rate the bank feels like it needs to make. So here's an actual example here. We can look at this one. Let's say the bank needs a 3% real rate, all right, to be worth doing this deal. There's an expectation of 6% inflation. So using our equation, you're saying that the real rate of 3% would be equal to the nominal minus 6% inflation. So what does the nominal need to be so that this all equals 3%? It would need to be 9%. And so as long as inflation's expected, and that's actually what happens, is the expectation in this example of 6%, and there's no redistribution. You just simply adjust your nominal rate as needed to maintain your purchasing power. All right, so that said, expected inflation and anticipated inflation can be totally dealt with, but even if inflation is perfectly anticipated, there could be a few other costs to inflation, particularly when we get to higher rates of inflation. Probably not such an issue at 2, 3, 4% inflation, but you get up to 15, 20%, 30% inflation. These sorts of things down here that are called resource costs of inflation could start to play a role. And that could be why we see or feel such a negative connotation to inflation. If you look around the world at places that have high inflation. You look back in history at different bouts of high inflation, you see a lot of problems where it actually damages the economy. And a lot of it can be traced to this resource cost of inflation. Resource costs are essentially opportunity costs. People are spending real resources not to be productive, but just to deal with inflation. So, for example, consumers have to spend more time price checking because just because you know what you paid yesterday, if we're talking about really runaway inflation, does not mean you know what it's going to be tomorrow. Producers have to do the same thing. They're buying inputs, of course, all the time to produce their goods, and so they're going to spend more time making sure they're getting the best price they can. And then the producers also face something called menu costs. A menu cost, the name can help, you can help remember it because you can think back to the day when people really would print out menus. They would print out catalogs, that sort of thing. It was great expense and time put in putting that physical thing together. And to raise prices then mean you had to run a whole new set of menus, set of catalogs, whatever. Of course, today with websites, this is less of an issue. But to the extent that you have any sort of menu, then there's actually a cost of raising your selling prices. Updating the catalogs, updating your websites would still have a cost. Somebody's got to go in there and do it. And then, of course, reprinting your menus and that sort of thing. So those are some of the things that would hit consumers and producers. What else? Let's see. We got wealth management. This could hit everybody in the economy, buyers and sellers, producers and consumers. If inflation is high, holding cash is costly because it's losing purchasing power. At least if you have it in the bank and you're getting some sort of interest rate on it, that's helping to keep the eroding power of inflation at bay a bit. But when it's in cash, you're just losing inflation. You're losing purchasing power at the rate of inflation. And so what you'll see then is people don't want to hold cash. There'll be a lot more trips to the bank. There's just less desire to hold cash, and that's going to cause inefficiencies in paying for things. And then finally, this last one here, in our country, we pay taxes based on our nominal income and nominal profits and don't have a way to subtract off the inflation rate for it. So it could result in an increase in taxes. All right, so at this point we've said the overall purchasing power of the average income in the economy not hurt. And we've seen that expected inflation can totally account for inflation, so there's no redistribution of income. We did acknowledge there are a few resource costs to inflation when it gets high. And so there's one last topic we want to talk about, and that is unanticipated inflation. If you can totally protect yourself from the impact of inflation with expected inflation, what happens when you don't expect it, when things don't turn out as you anticipated? So we can go back to our bank example and say if a bank expects 2% inflation, so that's their expectation for inflation is 2%, they want a 5% real return, you add those two together and you'll actually come up with a nominal rate. You need to state on the loan a 7% interest rate. So that's what they do. They make the deal. This could be a loan for a year, 2 years, could be over a period of time. And then what happens in reality is inflation actually turns out to be 4%. The bank was expecting 2% inflation, but it actually turns out to be 4%. So what would happen then? We'd have to rework this equation so that, let's see, we know the nominal is 7%. We know inflation is turning out to be 4%, so subtract off the inflation, and that will give me my real return of 3%. So I wanted a 5% real return, but when inflation turned up 2% higher than expected, I lose on my real return. So instead of getting a 5% return, I'll get a 3%. And then if instead inflation had turned out to be a lot lower, we would again start with the nominal of 7% minus the actual 1% inflation. And now the real return is 6%. So this shows us then that unexpected inflation does shift purchasing power from one side to the other. Now it's unanticipated, so you don't necessarily know who is going to win at the time. When this deal was made, this was obviously a good deal to both the bank and the borrower. but then reality happens and sometimes things come out differently. So that just gives you an idea of the true issues around inflation. It's not about the overall economy necessarily losing purchasing power. It's not that. And expected inflation doesn't cause any issues. But the two things that can be a problem would be those various resource costs we talked about and unanticipated inflation.